The title of my project is an analysis of the hukou system in China. And I'm sure many of you may be wondering, what is the hukou system? The hukou system is a household registration system in China that identifies a town, city, or village to which a person belongs. Every Chinese citizen has a hukou that contains all of the household's identifying information, such as births, deaths, and marriages. However, it is a state tool that serves the state's interests and priorities by limiting internal migration and determining how social services are allotted. The hukou system is primarily used for taxation and population counts. It is also used for the management of targeted people who are enemies of the state and outspoken critics. Hukou limits internal migration and locks people into their place of residence, and the type of registration is mostly permanent unless you have a very high education or lots of money. Rural and urban hukou are separate, and urban hukou is highly desirable because it is linked to citizenship rights and the allotment of social services, which are much better in the cities than in the countryside. Hukou dates back to the Han Dynasty in 206 BCE, and a form of hukou has been in use ever since. In 1954, the Constitution allowed for the freedom of movement, but as more people began to migrate, the 1958 legislation was used to control movement between rural and urban areas to stem the flow of people into the cities and to keep people in agricultural places. Hukou was fully enforced by 1962, barring any form of movement. The hukou system was relaxed in the early 1980s due to economic reforms and allowed for the freedom of migration with registration, but it did not change a person's hukou location or entitlement to social services. Dualism was created in the 1950s when China created specific agricultural and urban industrial societies. Hukou was used as a major instrument of the economy that allowed rapid industrialization but slow urbanization. Social stratification has resulted in disproportionate numbers of the very old and very young in the countryside, while those of working age are mostly in the cities. Spatially, this has led to a crowding of the cities and an emptying of the countryside, and there isn't enough manpower in rural areas to support optimal agricultural production. This resulted in a big gap in income inequality between the rural and urban populations. As you can see, the income gap is much higher in the rural population than it is in the urban. Since the 1980s, hukou has been relaxed, but has become more important to the urban population as a means of differentiating status. Urban hukou holders consider themselves to be at a much higher status than those who hold a rural hukou. Hukou and citizenship rights are intricately linked due to access to social services. Rural hukou holders who migrate to the cities are not eligible for basic urban welfare and social service programs, including public education, as you can see in this picture here. So you have the Beijing urban hukou holder running to public school, and you have the rural hukou holder hitting the wall. To receive an education beyond middle school, a student has to return to their home village, despite a lack of funding for schools in the countryside and a bias against students from the countryside for entrance into Chinese universities. Migrant workers who do not have an urban hukou are considered second-class citizens. The majority of migrant workers participate in rural to urban migration, and they go to the cities on the coast here, and they are mostly migrating from this area shaded in light gray here, and the 81% comes from the area shaded in light gray, and they also come from the areas in white as well. The relaxation of the countryside and the freeing of the peasants from the countryside has led to extremely cheap mobile labor. In the 1990s, the government recognized migrants as a labor force for the growing market. Migrant workers are frequently discriminated against, and legislation has been created to aid migrant workers, but it is not enforced. In 2011, President Hu Jintao recognized migrant workers as one of the biggest threats to social security. Migrant workers can be split into two groups, the older and the younger. The older group, which was born prior to 1980s, lived through tough times, the Cultural Revolution, and is more accepting of the hukou system and the opportunity to work and make money for their families. The younger generation, or second generation of migrant workers, is much more vocal, and they want to fight for better conditions. Mass incidents are protests, and there have been an increase of protests over time, with a spike in 2008 during the global financial crisis. The rise in protest is due to workers becoming more aware of their legal rights, and the protests have disrupted production at many different factories across China. The younger generation of workers has a technology skill to use mass media to their advantage, to organize and to fight for their rights. President Hu Jintao's Harmonious Society is an effort to free China from social problems. Although China desires a harmonious society where social problems are addressed, the economic reality makes it unrealistic. The Olympics can be seen as a case study of the power of the hukou system. Migrant workers who toiled to build the Olympic infrastructure, changing Beijing from a city of narrow alleyways into a city of skyscrapers, stadiums, and shopping streets. While building the Olympic infrastructure, the migrant workers had substandard living and working conditions. Migrant workers are seen as dangerous and uncivilized and were forced from the cities before the Games. Hukou was strictly enforced before, during, and after the Olympics to prevent migrant workers from entering the city. Efforts have been made to reform the hukou system since the 1980s, but it remains in place defining politics, society, and economic development. The deep reforms, initiated in 2001, were aimed at relaxing migration restriction and strengthening selective migration for people with special skills or money. However, nothing about these deep reforms were actually deep. They're mostly on the surface. The Sunjigang incident was where a college-educated man was tortured and killed by the police for not carrying his appropriate hukou papers. This caused a public outcry that resulted in attempts at reforms. However, the attempts to retool the system for the current society have had no real effects or lasting changes. The reforms made have helped to extend the life of the system, but the hukou system cannot be abolished because any reform must be gradual in order to maintain social stability and public security. As it cannot be abolished, the hukou system stands in China's way of becoming a world leader due to human rights issues, despite the fact that the hukou system is what helped China to achieve its growing economic status. Thank you.